Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we discuss the philosophy and skills of traveling light so you can experience the outdoors with more comfort, more safety, and more enjoyment. I'm Ryan Jordan.
And I'm Andrew Marshall, and we are your hosts on this lifelong journey of doing more with less as we venture into wild places and empty spaces.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Today's episode is all about backcountry food and nutrition. But before we jump in, we need to hit you with a standard medical disclaimer. We aren't doctors, we are not giving medical advice, and you should 100% check with your physician before making any kind of drastic dietary changes, especially if you're going into the backcountry. Okay, with that out of the way, Ryan, I'm really excited about this topic because I probably spend more time on the trail talking and thinking about food than just about anything else. And I don't think I'm alone in this. Just like gear, the subject of trail nutrition creates some pretty passionate debates in the world of ultralight backpacking.
I think those debates are intensifying as well, especially with the increasing awareness that food and nutrition is so intricately related to your overall health and athletic performance. And so, this has been going on for, a decade or more intensely, and backpacking roundtables and discussions are starting to pick this up. And so more and more backpackers are really paying a close attention to their diet and food planning, probably more so than they ever have. So yeah, it's a good time to talk about food and nutrition.
Yeah, and I think my own arc sort of into this world probably mimics what a lot of people have gone through. I did my AT thru hike in 2012, and I mostly lived on ramen noodles, oatmeal, peanut butter, Pop-Tarts, and Snickers bars, with the occasional gorging sessions at Chinese restaurants and pizza joints. And I think that that's probably what you would consider the standard American thru-hiker diet. Personally, I couldn't afford freeze-dried meals like Mountain House, and my thru-hike was kind of a last-minute thing, so I didn't have the time or resources to use Mel drops. This meant I was mostly relying on grocery stores and a lot of the time gas stations to resupply. So despite all this, of course, as any thru-hiker does, I ended up dropping just an obscene amount of weight, almost 40 pounds.
Oh, man.
But by the end of the hike, I was just physically wrecked. My body was falling apart. And partially this is because I wasn't in great shape, but I now know that my diet on the trail factored into how I was feeling by the time I got to Springer Mountain.
So you just felt that you just got continuously depleted and couldn't rebuild, or what?
I realized I wasn't healing as well, as I would get cuts and scrapes over the course of just walking. They just wouldn't heal up. Every day became more and more of a struggle to get up out of bed or, out of the tent, even after I got my trail legs and really felt strong on the trail. But then a few years later, I did my thru hike of the Colorado Trail, and I was better informed, better prepared. I was in better shape physically, and I just decided that I had to eat better. So I supplemented grocery store resupplies with a few mail drops. I made some homemade jerky. I added some higher quality nutrition to like my breakfasts and my dinners. So nuts and fruit at breakfast with oatmeal, and packaged chicken and fish and chia seeds and flax seeds and things like that through the course of the day. But I still found myself bonking, which we'll talk about later with our guest. Since then, I've made huge changes in my non-trail diet, and I mostly stay away from any kind of processed food, especially highly processed carbs. I've been experimenting with a modified form of the ketogenic diet, something I know a lot of our listeners are curious about, and I've been running some experiments on shorter trips to see how that all pans out. We'll get into that later, but in the meantime, Ryan, I'd be curious to know what your food journey has been like over the course of your life as a backpacker and kind of where you are now.
Well, when I was a teenager and a young adult, I started out with the 4 C's: chips, chocolate, cookies, and candy. And, it didn't take long for me to realize that this was not the kind of diet that's going to affect positive performance in the backcountry over the long term. So I started studying backpacking nutrition specifically in my late 20s to try to dial in what was going on. And the big thing I learned was that even when I was eating packaged foods from, Mountain House and the like back then, which, back then they were not very good, but the taste of packaged goods is so much better now. So we have more options available to us. But I noticed that my body changed when I switched to a quote unquote backpacking diet when I was on the trail, and disrupted my gut, my pain response, and all these different little physiological things. And so through the years, I've learned to try to maintain as much continuity between the nutrition I was getting in my day-to-day life and maintaining that continuity as I went into a backpacking trip. So that's really been the focus of my study over the last, 10 years or so.
Well, we definitely get into that point with our guest, so maybe we should just go ahead and introduce him.
There's a lot of hearsay and what some might call bro science out there regarding trail nutrition, so we wanted to get a scientific perspective on the issue. Our guest for this episode is Brian Rigby. Brian is a certified sports nutritionist, author, consultant, and podcaster. His writing focuses on the hard facts of nutrition science, and he has an extensive background working with outdoor athletes. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So let's start a little bit with your background. Tell us a little bit about how you got into nutrition for outdoor pursuits.
Well, I'm a climber and I've been climbing for years. I started getting my degree in nutrition, and it seemed like a good fit to start working with athletes while I was getting this higher education before I started working with medical clients. I enjoyed working with athletes so much that I continued doing so even after I graduated. I run a small practice here in Boulder, Colorado, and work mostly with climbers. But in general, I just love the outdoor perspective and try to bring a little bit more perspective to some of these sports that are not traditionally served by the sports nutrition community.
Over the course of our conversation, things might get pretty sciencey. Would you mind just kind of elaborating before we start on some terms that might come up? I'm thinking macronutrients, micronutrients, things like that.
Sure. Macronutrients are the energy-containing nutrients. There's three of them. There's the carbohydrates, fats, protein. There's also alcohol, technically a micronutrient or a macronutrient, but we don't usually refer to that when we're talking about sports nutrition or nutrition in general. Micronutrients are the essential vitamins and minerals. We need them, but we need them in far smaller quantities than we need the macronutrients. I'm going to talk a little bit about METs. Those are metabolic equivalents. That's essentially how we measure how hard an exercise is when we're doing it. I think those are the big ones that might not be immediately recognizable.
Maybe as a follow-up question to that, can you elaborate on what is the function of each of those macronutrients that you talked about? Because I think there is maybe some misconception about like what the function of protein is and things like that.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Protein is one of the things that people don't really seem to understand that well. And I think the problem is it is an energy-containing nutrient, right? It has 4 calories per gram, and which basically means that if you burn it, it'll release 4 calories of energy. But our body really does not want to burn energy, and we don't use it as an energy source except for when we have too much or when we absolutely have to. So when we're looking at the energy-containing nutrients, we're really focusing on carbohydrates and fats, and then protein, I say, serves a structural role. And that structural role means that we need smaller amounts of it, but we need to get a specific amount of it. That doesn't really change day to day. So if you are doing a long day of activity, you're going to need a lot more energy. You're going to need a lot more carbohydrates and fats. You're not going to need a lot more protein.
So, Brian, I think most people understand that caloric needs can vary wildly from person to person, but some cursory internet research reveals a lot of different and sometimes dubious math. What's the best way for our listeners to calculate their caloric needs per day for a long-term backpacking trip?
To start, you need to figure out what your resting metabolic rate is. And there are more accurate and less accurate ways to do it. If you can get your body fat tested, you can come up with a very specific number because you can actually compartmentalize how much protein you have, how much fat you have, and be able to determine to a pretty accurate extent how many calories you're burning per day. But you can get it within 5 to 10% of that just by doing a resting metabolic rate calculator, which you can find on the web. Most people, don't have too crazy of extremes when it comes to their fat percentage and their muscle percentage. After you know what your resting metabolic rate is, then you have to determine how hard you're working. And that's where these METs, or these metabolic equivalents of a task, come in. I think METs are the best way that we can really estimate it, especially for a long day of activity, just because it's too hard to, if you have, you can't really calculate the exact calories burned per hour if you're walking up a specific grade of a hill or carrying a specific weight. You can only kind of estimate how hard you're working for that. Or at least you can only really do that, it'd be very hard to bring the tools to calculate it more accurately than that. So when we're looking at METs, one MET would be the amount of calories you burn for just 1 hour of sitting quietly, not doing anything. And that's our baseline. If you did nothing all day, you would burn 24 METs. That would equal your resting metabolic rate. So 1 MET is equivalent to your resting metabolic rate divided by 24. Once we start doing harder activities, then it goes up. So for just regular walking, if you're not going uphill, not carrying anything, just maybe walking down the street, that would be around 3 to 3.5 METs, depending on the speed you're walking and your general fitness level. If you're doing just maybe a regular hike, going up a hill, breathing a little hard, but not necessarily out of breath, conversational pace, then you're looking at 5 to 6 METs. So again, that would be burning essentially your resting metabolic rate divided by 24 times 5 to 6. And then if you're carrying a heavy pack, you're going up steep terrain, you're breathing hard, you're really at the upper end of the exertion for what we might consider hiking before you move into maybe trail running or something that's even more intense, then we're looking at 7 to 9.5 METs. So it's still a big range. It depends on the intensity.
Yeah. What kind of MET output are your climbers doing if they're like vertical rock or ice climbing?
They're even above that. So with climbers, we're looking at it's pretty short bursts from bouldering where you're only going to be on a wall for about 30 seconds to 30 seconds max probably. That's would be somewhere around 16, 17, maybe even 20 METs. It's really high, but you can't hold on to the rock for longer than that. If you're sport climbing, it's lower than that, but still pretty high. Sport climbing would be in the range of a minute to 2 minutes. If you're indoors, maybe closer to 5 to 10 minutes if you're outdoors. And it's with ice climbing or with big wall climbing, anything that is going to, take up a long, or multi-route climbing, if you're taking up a larger chunk of your day, it goes down. But climbing in general is a much more anaerobic sport than hiking is, for example. We rely a lot more on anaerobic power systems. And as a result, we need rest in between. We need to stop every now and again, let those muscles recharge their anaerobic systems.
So I know that METs are usually calculated based on oxygen consumption, but is it a fair assessment to say that a 5 MET activity burns 5 times the calories as a 1 MET activity?
Yeah, that's the basic way the math works. Obviously, there's going to be individual differences, and it's hard to know for certain whether you are actually going to fit within 10% of that. But in general, if you're doing something that is 5 METs, it's going to be about 5 times more calories burned than 1 MET. And 1 MET, if you're sitting quietly doing nothing, it doesn't feel like anything. So it's really hard to actually term that and put it in terms of exertion. It's not like you're working 5 times harder when you are hiking than you are sitting down, because that math doesn't make sense when you say hiking is 5 times harder than sitting down. But in general, the caloric cost, that 1 MET represents just basic what our body's doing to survive. It's the amount of energy our organs require, the amount of energy our brain requires, pumping blood around, a little bit of the thermic cost of food, digesting our food. That's all wrapped into that. It's all energy that we need to spend, but we don't really feel ourselves spending. Whereas once we start moving the muscles, that's what we feel.
And so, like, if I go on the internet and I type in, resting metabolic rate calculator, I feel like I'm going to come across, 15 sites that 3/4 of which seem pretty sketchy. So do you have like a favorite way to find that out that you would recommend?
Honestly, I don't. The resting metabolic rate calculator, the nice thing about it is, you're right, probably a lot of those sites are sketchy, and I wouldn't trust the information, like the articles necessarily that you come across on them. But the calculator itself, it's based on just a standard equation. They should all give you the same answer, and you could cross test them, and every one of them should give you that same answer. The one thing that you want to be careful of is some of them have an activity multiplier, essentially. So if you're not working in METs, one of the ways that you might calculate how much energy you need is to put a modifier onto it. So, it'll say like, what's your average level of weekly exertion? Are you sedentary? Do you do light work? Do you do moderate? Do you do heavy? And then they'll put a modifier on that. So if you just is you're sedentary, they'll times it by 1.2. And that's what, I would say that's a good average for a day to day when you're not exercising or anything. You're just going to the grocery store and walking around doing chores. 1.2 is a good modifier, but it drops off in accuracy precipitously right after that. It's very hard to say, oh yeah, I work hard every day, so I'm heavy, intense exercise on a daily basis. Let's apply that 1.8x modifier to this resting metabolic rate and determine what my daily caloric needs are. It's much better to, if not do it through METs or just through, your own knowing what your activities are, then at least doing it on a daily basis.
Well, that's really good to know. And what about like fitness trackers and stuff, or apps like Endomondo or things like that? Like I can go in and say, okay, I'm hiking,
Mm-hmm.
and it wants my weight and my height, and then it'll tell me, at the end of my 10-mile hike, what it thinks I've burned. Do you find that to be accurate or no?
I think it can be. It's going to depend a little bit on how much that app is tracking. If it's just tracking distance and has no idea about altitude or anything, then it's probably not going to be able to give you a very good estimation. But I believe a lot of apps track that altitude now, altitude change, and wrap that into it. They should be able to give you a reasonably good guess, probably a better guess than you're going to be able to make without specialized equipment at any rate.
Moving on a little bit, this is a question about calories. So there's definitely a segment of the backpacking world that believes a calorie is just a calorie. That you can subsist off of ramen noodles and dried oatmeal as long as you're getting enough calories. And the reason they do that is because that's a high caloric density for its weight. So I guess the question is a calorie just a calorie? And is there any need to consider anything other than caloric density versus weight?
Well, I would say once we take protein out of the equation, calories are calories. I don't want to go down the road where we start talking about how well you absorb those calories, how well you use them. Like if your diet is consistent and it's been consistent for a while, you're going to use those calories regardless of what their source are. I would say that there is value to having diversity in your diet, even if it's a trip and and calories are, certainly the thing that your body's going to feel most immediately and to the largest impact. Even if that's true, there's value in making sure that your diet is diverse enough that you're going to be getting micronutrients as well. That's the vitamins and minerals.
I have a question on that because a lot of long distance backpackers and thru hikers will include tons of junk food in their diet. So you're looking at high calorie to weight ratios and things like Fritos and cheese and fried nuts and all these crazy foods that have calorie densities that are 130 to 160 or 170 calories per ounce. So there's some issues there. They obviously want to save weight because when you do the MET math, you're looking at, if you're hiking 12 or 14 or even 16 hours a day, you're looking at having to carry an enormous amount of weight and food. So in terms of calorie quality, and this is probably more of a nutrition question, is there a tipping point? Like at what point, how long do we have to spend on the trail before we really have to consider nutrition? I mean, I know I can probably go out and eat Fritos for a 3-day hike and not damage my body too badly, but I wouldn't be able to do that on a 6-month thru hike, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, the longer the hike is, the more attention you're going to have to pay to that to meal diversity and making sure that you're getting enough of each of the micronutrients. If it's a day, if it's 3 days, even if it's a week, you're probably going to find. I would say even up to a month. And I wouldn't recommend doing it for a month, but you could survive on a very simplistic, junky diet for a month and probably not notice or suffer any complications whatsoever. And one thing to keep in mind is a lot of these junk foods are fortified with some of the more common nutrients that you might get a deficiency within, particularly the B vitamins. So vitamin B1, 2, 3, that's thiamine, riboflavin, niacin. They're fortified in those just because the processing of the raw material, the processing of the flour is going to remove them. And we learned a long time ago that we need to add them back in. So you won't suffer any egregious up to about a month, I would say. After that, you should probably pay more attention.
So you won't suffer any health problems, but will your performance be affected?
That's a tough question to give a definitive answer on. A lot of these long-term problems certainly do lead to lower performance, but it's hard to quantify. It's hard to quantify because in the short term, calories just do so much more for your performance than anything else does. When we're looking at getting optimal levels of vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients, and just having a diverse diet, we start looking at the role that your general health plays in your performance. And certainly it plays a large role. But if you're just saying like, I want to perform as high of a level as I can, then you can do that. You can look at like Usain Bolt, who famously ate his, I think it was chicken nuggets. He had a chicken McNugget diet. And he's one of the top sprinters in the world, did great with it. But then a couple of years after that, after he advertised that diet and saying, oh, that's all I need to eat. A couple of years later, he's saying, actually, I've learned that I need to eat a better diet. I need a more diverse diet. And he's eating a healthier diet now because he's realized that, especially as he's gotten older, that his performance has been suffering. Even though, in the short term, he was certainly breaking records, winning medals, and doing great, as time spread on, the performance started taking a hit.
So for somebody who's planning a 3-day backpacking trip versus a 3-month thru hike, is there a difference in macronutrient ratios that you might recommend for a short versus a long-term hike?
I would say you should, regardless of the length of your hike, you should do what it feels good and is comfortable for you. That's one of the nice things about hiking, as opposed to maybe some other sports, that it's very much aerobic and our body is very agile when it comes to burning calories aerobically. It can switch from carbohydrates to fats. It can, burn a very high fat diet, kind of a ketogenic diet. It can burn a very high carb diet and be perfectly happy. It's very adaptable. The most important thing on that is that our body does take time to adjust, though. So if you are planning on switching your diet during your hike, you should really do so at least 2 weeks, probably 3 or 4 weeks beforehand, just so that your body has time to adapt to the new sources of calories and where you're getting your energy from.
Well, that might be a good segue into the next question. We had a lot of listeners write in and ask about high fat or ketogenic strategies for backpacking. So maybe we could start out with you just describing sort of what ketosis is, what are some of the effects of eating high fat, low carb, and maybe we can move on from there.
Sure. Ketosis is a state. It's, I might get some hate mail here, but it's not a natural state. It's not a state that we find in any animal, at least not any mammal naturally. But it's an adaptive state, essentially, where when our body does not get enough carbohydrate, or for certain other animal species, when it doesn't get enough protein to turn into carbohydrate, our brain needs to run on something. And we also need these byproducts to be able to burn fat. So fat itself, when we burn it aerobically, goes through the citric acid cycle. We say that fat burns in carbohydrates flame. When you remove that carbohydrate, it needs something else to help it burn. So it starts producing these ketone bodies. And ketosis is a state where you're eating so much fat and so little carbohydrate that our body is overproducing these ketone bodies. We're always producing a few of them, but we're overproducing them, and our body essentially learns to switch over to burning those for fuel, specifically the brain. So ketosis, not necessarily a natural state, but it's one that we humans have learned how to put ourselves in. And we've also learned over time that it's not necessarily as dangerous as we once believed it was. We believed it was dangerous for a long time because we would only see it in diabetics, and it led to acidification of the blood, ketoacidosis. So we thought it was this purely negative condition. And certainly when you see it in diabetics, it still is a negative condition. That's something that a diabetic would want to work with a doctor on. But if you're a otherwise healthy human being, putting yourself into ketosis on purpose, probably not as dangerous as we once believed.
Is there any risk at all? I mean, what do you see as the main disadvantages of doing that?
The main disadvantage is it completely saps your anaerobic power systems. So we have two in our entire body. We have two anaerobic power systems. We have creatine phosphate, which is very rapid. It's burned out fast. It provides enough energy for like 5 to 7 seconds. Extremely important for climbers, probably not as important for hikers. And then we have the anaerobic glycolysis, burning, essentially splitting the glucose molecule into 2 pyruvate molecules, which gives us just a tiny amount of ATP, but our body can do it rapidly and give us energy right off the bat. When you go into ketosis, when you change your diet so that you're not eating carbohydrates or eating very little carbohydrate, then you drain your body of glycogen and you can no longer have this anaerobic system, this anaerobic glycolysis. So even though we'll see in studies, we have about 3 decades of studies now that will show that, okay, people perform more or less equivalent when they're going at an aerobic pace on a ketogenic diet versus a mixed diet. What we see is that they have highly impaired sprint ability. A lot of these are done on cyclists, and they'll show that the cyclists can cycle for the same amount of time, regardless of what their diet is on. But then when they give them a sprint portion, when they tell them to go as hard as they can, then the ones in ketosis just can't go at the same pace.
That's super interesting.
Yeah. So for some athletes, that's highly important, even including aerobic athletes. So you don't want to be a cyclist who can go forever, but then when it comes to the sprint to the finish, they can't do anything. That's not the type of athlete that most cyclists want to be. When you're talking about hiking, again, probably not of too much concern. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think many hikers sprint to the finish.
So that's the disadvantage. What is there an advantage?
There is an advantage, and there would particularly be an advantage for for hikers that are weight conscious. And the advantage is that fats are not only are they nutritionally calorically dense, meaning that they have over twice as many calories per gram as carbohydrates, but fats are also naturally less. They're more dehydrated. They don't tend to have nearly as much water in them because fats are hydrophobic, of course. So high fat foods tend to already be low in water weight. You tend to not need to dehydrate them or do as many alterations in order to bring them to a lower weight. And so that's an advantage there, that you can carry less weight. Whether that advantage is actually, worthwhile for the average person, that's a little harder to answer. A ketogenic diet is pretty hard for a lot of people to follow. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that when you go online and you look up ketogenic diet or ketogenic diet for thru-hiking, you're going to see a lot of success stories and people advocating for it. What you're not going to see is all the people who tried it and were like, I didn't really like it. I didn't do well on it. My stomach was upset on it, which can happen a lot with high-fat diets. You're not going to see, the large middle range. You just see the people who did great on it, and are very excited about it.
Yeah, bloggers don't tend to blog about mediocrity too much.
Right, exactly. But we know that, there's a lot more in the middle like that.
Right. One of the benefits of ketogenesis is the ability to tap into your body's fat stores. And this is a really interesting question that I know hikers on our forums investigate and discuss. So to what extent is it successful at tapping into existing body fat stores?
That's a bit of a trick question, because you also burn fat when you're on a high carbohydrate diet. Certainly you can lose weight when you're eating just carbohydrates. So with a ketogenic diet, you are training your body to use more fat, to burn more fat, but you're not changing thermodynamics. You're not changing how much fat your body is capable of burning. All you're doing is giving it a different fuel. Your body's like, oh, hey, we got fat to burn now. I'm going to switch to more fat, oxidizing enzymes, to a more fat oxidizing metabolic profile. And so you start burning more fat. But the flip side of that is you're also eating more fat. So you are tapping into your body's fat stores, because our body is constantly recycling fat. It's constantly storing new fat and pulling fat out of our stores to burn. But it's not like it's not like you've taught your body to just run off of your body fat by itself. And if you are eating a ketogenic diet with the purpose of losing weight, you're still going to need to go into a caloric deficit, and it's not going to be any more or less effective than if you were eating any other diet.
Right, sure. I think the goal is to figure out how to be as efficient as possible in tapping into your body's fat stores when you're on a long distance hike, so you're not having to carry so much food weight. So is there any way to hack that system through intermittent fasting or anything like that?
Your body does not really want to burn your body fat. When you start moving up, the more body fat you have on you, the more willing your body is to shed it and get rid of it. But if you're at a healthy weight, at a regular weight, then your body is going to avoid burning that body fat unless it's specifically given signals that it should be burning that. And those signals are, I'm not getting enough calories. You can't really force it. You can't make it burn those calories on your body without giving it that signal, because it would be very strange for the body to be consuming enough calories and to have those calories. Those calories are absorbed into your system. You've got those carbohydrates and those fats, and to a lesser extent, the protein floating around in your blood, more or less. And it would be very strange for your body to have those calories in the blood readily available, and for it to say to itself, nah, I don't want those calories. I'm going to do the work to take calories out of the fat and burn those instead. Now,
Yeah.
this is, a little bit simplified just for the purpose of not making it overly complex. Your body's constantly, pushing molecules into your fat cells, taking them back out. It's a circle, but if you provide your body with calories, those calories are within your blood. They are available, and because they're available, your body's going to use them preferentially. And it doesn't matter if they are dietary fats or carbohydrates or protein in certain cases.
Well, let me ask you about bonking, because I really have a problem with bonking, especially on, day 5 or 6 of a hike. I'll get up and eat breakfast, and I'll be going along around, 9 or 10, and just completely crash, unless I eat a Snickers bar. So then I started experimenting with high fat diets just in my real life and in hiking, and I found that didn't happen as much, and I also found like I was more satisfied and less hungry at the end of a day after a meal. Is
Mm-hmm.
that just me experiencing placebo effect because that's what I was expecting to experience, or is there something actually there?
Well, what is your diet like just day to day when you're not going on a hike?
Oh, it's I would call it modified keto. I found ketogenic to be like all those side effects that you've already mentioned, plus just not realistic to maintain over a long period of time. So I eat beans and things like that.
Okay. Sorry, I meant like when you were bonking and on hikes. What was your diet like then?
It's what I would call standard American hiker diet. So oatmeal, Snickers bars, Pop Tarts, and ramen noodles.
So what I would say is, without knowing more about the situation specifically, is that a ketogenic diet, these high-fat diets, they do make it a lot easier to avoid bonking because you are not relying on your muscle glycogen stores nearly as much. One interesting thing that we've actually found out in the last decade, we used to say that high-fat diets were glycogen sparing because we noticed a decade past that when you switch to a high-fat diet, that you didn't use a lot of muscle glycogen. Now, this isn't a full ketogenic diet. We still have people would still have good muscle glycogen stores. They just didn't seem to be using them as much. They were using them much more slowly. And we thought, oh, that's a great thing. People aren't using as much glycogen. So we once called it a glycogen sparing, but now we call it more of a glycogen limiting or glycogen impaired diet. So, or essentially what's happening, we realized, is that our body is no longer very capable of burning glycogen. That's kind of neither here nor there because it doesn't really matter. If you're burning fat efficiently, then you don't necessarily need that glycogen, except for, as I mentioned earlier, in these anaerobic high power situations. But it does help you to avoid bonking because you're no longer running off of that muscle glycogen. You're much better able to spare your blood glucose just for the brain because you're burning more fat. Now, the reason you were probably bonking isn't because you were eating a regular carbohydrate diet, but because the number of carbohydrates you were consuming for the exertion level that you were at was probably too low. You can definitely eat a higher carbohydrate diet and not bonk, even if you're going out for 6 days. But what it sounds like is, especially if you're on day 5 or day 6 and you've consistently been eating fewer carbohydrates than what your body would be used to for that level of exertion, you're slowly draining your muscle glycogen stores. Your liver glycogen is having a hard time keeping up with the demands of your brain and your muscles. And so you start developing low blood glucose and eventually you bonk.
So to simplify a little bit, solutions for bonking could actually include high fat diet on the trail,
Mm-hmm.
or you're saying just double your breakfast.
Double your breakfast or just increase the carbohydrate content of it. Again, I think it's important to look at what your daily, like when you're not on a hike, what the diet you've been eating as you're prepping for it. So if you can normally eat a fairly high carbohydrate diet, then you've trained your body to burn carbohydrates. And there's nothing good or bad about that, except for possibly in certain performance situations. It's just a fact. Your body is used to burning carbohydrates for energy. And then when you go on a hike and you provide it with carbohydrates, but you don't provide it at quite the same percentage of the calories, then you're not your body's is going to have to transition towards burning more fat. But in the meantime, because that transition takes time, your body's failing and you're slowly using up your glycogen storage, you're using up your glucose, and that's where the issue comes in with the bonking. So yeah, you can either, and in the meantime, switch to a high fat diet, do that a few weeks in advance. And then you're not going to need to worry about bonking. You're not going to need to worry about the carbohydrate content day to day. You can eat a more mixed diet. Like you can make a higher fat diet without going high fat. You can have a 30 to 40% fat diet and still have 40% carbohydrates in your diet. If you do that, you're also probably going to be more resistant to bonking. Or you can accept that your diet's a high carbohydrate diet and just make sure that as you're hiking, most of your calories are still coming from carbohydrates, which might present a weight problem. But you will have to look at the math on that.
All right. Well, we could probably talk about ketosis all day, and I'm sure we'll get some more listener questions about that. But for now, we'll move on to micronutrients. So what's the best way to keep those things balanced while in the backcountry for an extended period of time?
Again, a diverse diet is going to be the most important thing, especially a diverse diet with whole foods. Whole foods insofar as you're able to bring them. I realize that some things like fresh fruits and vegetables are going to be a little more challenging, and drying of those does rob a certain amount of some micronutrients. But the good news is most of the micronutrients will be preserved, even if you dry it. And most of them are going to come from foods that are from the major calorie containing foods, not from vegetables. Certainly, we want a lot of vegetables in our diet in a daily life situation. We don't want to be those people who don't eat vegetables, But since you can't bring fresh vegetables on a long hike, that's not an option. When we look at the micronutrients that you're most likely going to have trouble getting, the biggest one is just vitamin C. Vitamin C basically comes from fresh fruits and a few fresh vegetables. And because it's just such a sensitive micronutrient, it's much more likely to actually oxidize and no longer be effective or no longer be present when you dry your food. And it's not found in any of our major calorie containing foods other than fruits. So, but the good news with vitamin C is that we don't need a ton of it. And we need about 70 to 90 milligrams per day. 70 for a female, 90 for a male. That would take care of 100% of 97.5% of people's needs. If you look at a pack of emergency, just one pack has 1,000 milligrams in it, which means that one pack would be good for 10 days. You wouldn't want to take it all at once because you wouldn't be able to absorb all of it at once. You'd just pass a lot of it out, or you'd excrete a lot of it out. But if you divvy that up, that's a very little amount of power to get the one micronutrient that you are likely to be low on or have trouble getting through your diet.
So I have a follow-up question based on the needs of thru hikers. So let's just assume that they're not getting enough micronutrients between their resupplies, which are usually, like 5 days. So they drop into town once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks on rare occasions. How often do they need to be eating healthily in town, or can they continue to gorge on pizza for a few more months and be cool with that? How frequently do we need to replenish these micronutrients?
Well, thankfully, our body is actually extremely good at these periods of time when we're not getting them. We've kind of been trained, I think, as a culture to think of micronutrients as a daily thing. We even have like multivitamins and they're called one a day. But the reality is we don't need micronutrients one a day. For my clients, I've moved to more of trying to think about them in a weekly implement or in a weekly structure. So making sure that across a week, you're getting enough micronutrients. Realistically speaking, you can go even longer than that. What happens is, as our body realizes that's not getting enough, it starts holding on to the micronutrients better. It starts recycling them and, doing whatever it can to make sure that we don't actually run out. Ultimately, if we don't eat them, if we don't get them through our diet, we will run out, but it takes a little while to do it. And especially, even if they're gorging on bad foods, they're getting some. So probably they're not going to run into problems right away. If you are in town, though, if you're able to eat normal food and you're able to eat vegetables, then you should take advantage of that and definitely, gorge on the foods that you're not going to be able to get when you are, hiking. But when to more specifically answer your question, how often should you be refueling? Once a week would be great. If you can't, make sure that your diet is going to be extra high in nutrition, extra high in these micronutrients, then you should, once per week, then you should at least try to get it bi-weekly.
So let's say I'm coming into town. I walk past the Chinese restaurant. I walk past the Pizza Hut. I find a salad bar somewhere. What am I loading my plate with? Is like a tangerine and a spinach salad good to go, or what?
Well, I think here the more important thing would be that you're actually spreading it out a little bit. So, if you're in and you're going to have dinner, you're probably going to be around for breakfast too, I assume. Just try to get more of these smaller meals with these nutrients. Our body's not great at absorbing large quantities of any single nutrient at a single time. So you do want to get, a higher nutrition meal if you can, but you want to get more of them. So maybe that tangerine and that salad would be good for one meal, but make sure that you're going to have, a couple more within that day even. So maybe instead of having, one big salad and one, orange instead of tangerine, one larger piece of fruit, have, I don't want to say have smaller ones, but have more of them. If that makes
More
sense.
frequent dosing.
Yeah.
And I know you've done some writing on multivitamins. Is there any reason not to use a multivitamin on the trail?
Man. Yeah, I wrote a whole book called The Multivitamin Lie. I'm not a fan of multivitamins. And I'm not a fan because the research just doesn't show that they do anything. There's never been a single study, large scale study, that shows people that take a multivitamin consistently to be any healthier than those who don't, including in areas that you would think they would be, like impoverished parts of China. You think that, if you're not eating a healthy, diverse diet like your average American can, that you would get some benefit out of making sure you have enough nutrients. But they don't have better health outcomes. A lot of the benefits of our healthy diet isn't just because we're getting, 100% of our need for magnesium and for vitamin C. It comes from all the myriad of phytonutrients and these other factors that we're still not quite sure how to quantify within vegetables and within healthy food in general. Multivitamins, there's not really a downside to them other than that you're spending money on something that hasn't really been shown to be effective. There's a little bit of research, for certain nutrients, particularly the antioxidant nutrients, that too high of an intake of those can lead to worse health outcomes. But I don't think that's going to be of concern for a hiker that's taking it maybe just for the duration of their thru hike.
So that said, is there any supplement that you might recommend for somebody who's, training for a long hike or doing a long hike?
No, micronutrients, if your diet is diverse and healthy and you're training for it, you should be okay on all of them. Certainly, depending on the particulars of your diets, you might need a little bit of help in some areas, like vegans and vegetarians might need to take vitamin B12. But that kind of goes down to an individual level at that point. And because I should say that there's plenty of support for individual nutrients in specific cases. Women many times need iron just because they have a higher rate of blood loss, and they need to produce more hemoglobin than a male does, so they have higher iron needs, and sometimes their iron needs aren't met by their diet. There's support for that as a concept. There just isn't support for taking a bulk multivitamin, multimineral, and seeing better outcomes. We don't see that happen.
Well, you mentioned vegetarians and vegans. That kind of leads into the next question. Do you have any strategies for vegetarians and vegans while backpacking?
Well, I think that when we look at them, they actually suffer, or they actually have probably the same difficulties as anybody has when they are going on an extended hike. Protein might be slightly more of an issue, depending, but a lot of the foods that at least a lot of the high carbohydrate foods that you might bring that are dried can also be high protein. You can bring lentils. The lentils are a great protein source. We don't need to combine them with any other proteins. They have all the essential amino acids that we would need, so they would work perfectly fine. You also have things that are maybe a little bit less of a high quality, like quinoa and some of the other pseudo grains and whole grains. But in the amounts that you will be eating them while you're on an extended hike, if we're talking about caloric costs of 4,000 to 6,000 calories per day, and you're eating food to meet those costs, then you're probably getting enough protein from those foods, even if they're not the highest protein foods that you can find. Vegans may have their major supplement issue, or their major micronutrition issue, would be calcium. Calcium, vegans would normally get it from leafy greens. Leafy greens are actually a very good source of calcium, contrary to what most of us might think or believe. And you're not going to be able to get enough leafy greens as a vegan on a hike to supply your calcium needs. So a calcium supplement would probably be called for.
Yeah, it's interesting, these individual eating habits, especially as you kind of drill down various eating lifestyles, definitely reveal some more particular needs, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can talk about nutrition as and certainly when I'm writing articles on my blog, I'm talking about nutrition for as many people as I can. And that does a great job of kind of summarizing what the average person needs. But when you talk with a person and you get the specifics of their diet and the specifics of what they're training for or what they're trying to achieve, then the specific strategies start changing up.
So I'm a mountain guy. I like spending most of my hiking time above 10,000 feet. So, and I live at a fairly high altitude here in Laramie. It's over 7,000. So how does altitude affect caloric and nutritional needs, and how can a backpacker compensate accordingly?
Altitude's an interesting situation because we have the density of oxygen is lower. It's harder to breathe because we're getting less oxygen from each breath. And hypothetically, that would lend itself to burning carbohydrates better because carbohydrates, the molecule contains oxygen within it. We require less oxygen to burn it. So hypothetically, if you need less oxygen to burn it, it would be more efficient. And we do see that, that's one of the performance advantages of carbohydrates. Not necessarily a relevant one for hikers, but it is an advantage of carbohydrates. But the interesting thing is, even though carbohydrates hypothetically would be burned more efficiently, and probably are, they also, we don't see a ton of performance improvements from a high caloric or a high carbohydrate diet at altitude. And the other issue is a lot of people start suffering from a loss of appetite when you get to a high altitude. And it's very hard to refuel yourself when you're not hungry with food that is already not particularly calorically, calorie dense. So even though if I were to just without knowing the person, without knowing the situation, just make a blanket statement of, hey, carbohydrates are probably better at altitude. The reality is that for most people, they probably would not be better. The bigger issue is getting enough calories in general. And if the only way that I can assume that you're going to get enough calories to eat more fat, then eating more fat would be the right move, even if you're slightly less efficient at burning it because of the lower oxygen.
So are you saying that you said at altitude we're less efficient at burning calories, yet there's some commentary out there that suggests that your caloric needs go up at altitude for the same amount of work at lower altitude. So which is it?
Well, you're burning energy less efficiently, or rather, you have less oxygen available. And when we're looking at the limiting factor in the aerobic energy system, it's the amount of oxygen available. So you are less capable, per gulp of air, you have less ability, you burn less calories per gulp of air, essentially, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Your energy needs will potentially go up, but those needs are kind of separate from the effect of the oxygen upon your metabolism.
Is it fair to say then that a bag of Fritos can fuel more activity at lower altitude than at higher altitude?
Well, a bag of Fritos, the carbohydrates would be more efficient. I mean, they're more efficient than fat at all altitudes. So they're about 10% more efficient. This is per unit of oxygen, by the way. When we're looking at just calorics or calories, then fats tend to be more efficient. But since oxygen is the limiting factor, when we look at carbohydrates, they're about 10% more efficient. And that efficiency could be better at altitude.
Okay.
But again, it really depends on the person. It's not going to be when we say 10% more efficient, it's not like you're going to perform 10% better if you're eating a carbohydrate diet.
Right. And that leads into the question I really wanted to ask is, if we're at higher altitude, can we reduce our food weight by 10%?
No, I don't think so. I think you're going to need to increase your food weight.
Right. That's what I was getting at. Exactly. Good.
Yeah.
What about temperature? Because I've always heard that in colder situations you're going to need to eat more because you're burning more to stay warm. Is that an old wives' tale, or is that true?
Well, yeah. I mean, as you're it's staying warm. We have a specific type of fat that we use to do that, brown adipose tissue, and then just in general, we'll get warm just from using calories. But it does take calories to keep your body warm, and so the warmer you are, the more it will calorically cost. And actually, even as it gets hotter, when it gets to be a very hot situation, you're also going to be burning more calories just to try to stay cool. Your body's always working to keep us at that sweet spot of about 98.6 degrees. So anytime you stray outside of that, then it starts getting harder.
Is there a percentage there? Like if I know I'm going to be below freezing for most of my trip, is there a way to calculate how much more food I would need to bring?
I don't think so. I think the bigger question there is going to be, or the bigger thing to concentrate on and at that point is making sure that you're bringing clothing that's going to allow you to keep an optimal body temperature without forcing your body to burn calories just to be staying warm. You wouldn't want to be shivering the entire time. You also want to be wearing so much that you're sweating and then, causing the sweat to pool up, and that would cause a chill as well. But making sure you're wearing warm, breathable clothing, something that is going to keep your body at a comfortable temperature, is more important than figuring out how much more food you would want to bring just so that you can spare the calories to stay warm.
Got it. Well, so your approach to nutrition is very science-based. What are some of the biggest myths or misinformation you've come across with regards to fueling up for outdoor athletes?
I don't come across as many myths as I come across kind of pseudoscientific belief systems, if that makes sense, the difference. um, I don't really see people, like thinking things that are just outright wrong. Rather, I see people taking an idea, like the ketogenic diet, for example, and pushing it to such an extreme that it no longer has any basis in science. They've taken something that certainly has a scientific basis, like I'll use the ketogenic diet as the example here, where we have evidence that the ketogenic diet can work, and that in certain situations and for certain athletes it can be effective. But what we don't have evidence of is that it's a superior diet. And certainly we don't have evidence that it's a superior diet for everyone. And yet you'll see people with entire websites devoted to trying to convert everybody that they can reach to a ketogenic diet, telling them about how, they perform better and how, they've got unlimited energy and they go faster and they do better. And I'm not going to question whether that's true for them, but it's probably not true for everybody. And they're not taking that into consideration. So they've taken this idea that has at least a little bit of a basis in science, and now they've just come to conclusions that are not supported at all. We don't have any evidence that a ketogenic diet offers superior performance for the average athlete or for any of the athletes that we've seen studied. So that's more what I come across. I come across these ideas that that are rooted in science, but are taken way too far, to way too much of an extreme. You see it with with micronutrients as well. People have very strong ideas about how many micronutrients you need. We have the RDA, which ostensibly tells us how much we need, and most people interpret that to mean that that's like a minimum that we would need. 100%. If you reach 100% of your RDA, then you have achieved the amount of a particular vitamin or mineral that you need, and you don't need more. Some people have taken that to mean, oh, okay, well, that's a minimum. The government scientists, they don't have our best interest in heart. They just want to prevent deficiency. We actually need a lot more than that. We benefit from a lot more than that. The RDA really measures the maximum amount that a person would benefit from, and that's for 97.5% of the population, meaning that 97% of the population would actually need less of that to still be healthy.
So you're talking about the kind of concept that people have where it's like, okay, I need vitamin C for a functional immune system. I only need 90 milligrams. So I'm going to take a pack of emergency and that's going to boost my immune system. That's the kind of like thinking you're talking about, right?
Right, exactly. Where we know that vitamin C has a role in the immune system, and we know that it has a variety of other functions. And we have determined over the course of time that not even the average person needs less. But if we set the RDA at 90 milligrams for males, and 100% of people eat 90 milligrams exactly of vitamin C, that 97.5% of those people will have their needs met. And then 2.5% would actually need a little bit more. Not a lot more, but just a little bit more. So we have this base idea, and then some people are looking at it and saying, oh, well, I need, this much more, because if this much is good, then that much is great. When the reality is that 90 milligrams is more than enough at meeting. It'll meet 100% of our bodily needs, at least for 97.5% of people. Most people are actually going to need far less than that. And it's not just preventing deficiencies. If you look at how much vitamin C you need to consume to prevent scurvy, it's 10 milligrams per day. That's a very low amount. That's 1/9 of how much the government recommends. So it's not like we're just trying to prevent deficiencies. No, we're looking at what vitamin C does in the entire body and how much you need to meet all of those needs.
That's really fascinating to me. This whole dynamic is prevalent in so many other areas that we look at as well. And my heart for the podcast and the webinar series and things like that is to really start to tackle some of these ideologies and dogmas and bring some rational discussion to them. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, that's what I try to combat just in my own little way within the climbing community through my website, Climbing Nutrition. I want people, I want not just to provide good sports nutrition advice, I want to help people fight dogma, as you put it. Try to think rationally about these things and understand how nutrition works. Not just, how you might specifically perform better, but be able to look at a concept that somebody's thrown out there on the web on some random forum and think to yourself, well, does that really make sense? Is that something that, that there's a scientific basis for or backing for? What can I know about this just, using a critical mind?
So as we wrap up, I want to ask one more question. If for those of us who are not food and nutrition scientists or professionals, is there like a single best thing that we can do to improve our nutrition related performance as it relates to backpacking outside?
I mean, calories are always going to be the biggest thing. Making sure you get enough. I think that a lot of people, and this is probably true within the hiking world as well, you want to cut costs, not like money costs, but you want to cut weight, you want to cut how much food you're eating. And you might not necessarily want to, you run off the fat stores, but you might want to avoid, just eat the least that you can while still maintaining weight. But the problem is that as we continue cutting costs, even if we're not losing weight, we are slowing down some of these recovery systems. We're slowing down the amount that we're devoting to things like muscular repair. And over time, that's going to take a toll. You might be familiar with the concept of overtraining. I call it undernutrition. It's where you're doing so much training, you're working so hard, you're just not consuming enough calories to repair the muscles and to take care of all of your needs. And over time, that leads to increased rate of injury, increased rate of illness, and it can lead to far worse outcomes as well. So I would say calories is the big thing here. You want to make sure that you're eating enough, not just so that you're avoiding losing weight, but that you're eating enough to actually support the activity that you are doing. And after that, eating enough vegetables.
So as a backpacker, if I've been on the trail and let's say it's been a long, hard day of 8 or 10 or 12 hours of hiking, is there some, meal I want to eat that night and maybe the next morning that will facilitate repair and prevent my body from breaking down as much?
Yeah. First depends on what your diet's going to be. So if you're eating a mostly high carbohydrate diet, make sure that you're eating plenty of carbohydrates. If it's right afterwards, you're probably going to be consuming at least 60 per hour for the next 3-4 hours. That's a lot. But to replenish the muscle glycogen and your liver glycogen, make sure you're going well. After that, protein. I've talked a little bit about how protein works structurally. It's more of a structural nutrient earlier. It's also it works in almost like a hormonal way. You want to get a certain amount to trigger muscle protein synthesis. It's about 20 grams of high quality protein to maximally trigger muscle protein synthesis. More than that doesn't do anything more. We reach a plateau point at about 20 grams. And less than that, you get a drop off. It's pretty linear overall, but you do experience a drop off if you only eat like 10 grams. So about 20 grams of high quality protein will trigger muscle protein synthesis to the greatest extent possible. So just making sure that your meal also is That's not really a high protein meal, but I call it a high protein meal, 20 grams of protein within that meal after eating, and throughout the day as well. Making sure that you're getting protein in 20-gram doses at a time is a positive thing.
Well, Brian, thanks so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
Where can people find you online? Website, Facebook, etc.?
Yeah, I've got a website, climbingnutrition.com. I have a Facebook page. It's the same, Climbing Nutrition. So facebook.com/Climbing Nutrition. And you can reach me through there. Update it pretty frequently.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Well, for me, that was a really enlightening and interesting interview. And I'm glad we were able to bring a guest on that kind of had a rational approach and didn't have a specific agenda to push. I think a lot of times with food is such a sensitive subject for people. And, there's a lot of dogma and arguing about what's the best diet. And it's just nice and refreshing to hear that the best diet is one that is highly diverse and paying attention to nutrition is important.
Yeah, it really makes a difference. And the more I hike and the more I eat better food, the more I see my hiking performance just really improve. So we have a lot of listener questions about this subject. So let's go ahead and dive right into some.
Okay, so we're going to start off with a couple of questions that multiple people asked. And one of the most popular questions was this one. What is the best way to eat keto or fat adapted on the trail? Now, I don't have a lot of experience with this, Andrew. I've experimented with ketogenic diets in day-to-day life and went on one for the purpose of training and weight loss, just kind of an experiment. And I didn't really like it. I didn't feel good on it, but I know other people have had positive experiences with it. And I know you have experimented with it. So tell us about what you've been able to do.
Yeah, so I've run some experiments on shorter hikes, 3 or 4 day hikes. I think Brian's point in the interview is super important. He mentioned not changing your diet, as you get out of the car and go onto the trail. So you, especially with keto, I think you don't want to be eating your normal diet and then hop on the trail day one and suddenly switch over to a high fat diet. That is going to be an utter failure. So spending a couple of weeks, months, even I would say, adapting your body to burn fat is definitely what you're going to want to do before you experiment with it on the trail.
So what do you do on the trail for trail food then?
Well, this last time I did a lot of cheese, a lot of like preserved meat, so like summer sausage, and then some really high fat nuts. So you could do macadamia nuts, almonds. Macadamia nuts are great because they have a really high caloric density. Of course, you're going to pay for that. But so a lot of nuts, a lot of meat, a lot of cheese, coconut oil, olive oil, and this is where I deviate a little bit from keto, is I also did a lot of lentils and black beans. So I found in my day-to-day life that a strict keto diet is not really sustainable for me. And I think, as Brian was pointing out, it's kind of put forth as this magic bullet, but there really are no magic bullets in life. So you really have to approach these things with sort of a grain of salt and a little healthy dose of skepticism.
Yeah, definitely.
So I find that the beans kind of help to round out the meal, and they do give me, a little bit of carbohydrates to use as a fuel source in addition to the fat. Right. So that all being said, I do think, as Brian was saying, that the takeaway is, with a fat adapted diet, you're going to be super efficient in terms of your weight versus your caloric density. And that's what I really found to be really effective about it. And I also found that I didn't bonk very much at all.
Yeah. So like I said, I don't have much experience with keto, but in 2015, I started training more intensively, and specifically for a long distance glacier expedition. And I didn't do keto, but I did do intermittent fasting. And the idea was for fat adaptation. And it was incredibly effective, and I felt great on it. And I still engage in intermittent fasting a couple days a week now, and that is one aspect of fat adaptation that I've really enjoyed. And I'll even intermittent fast on the trail, and so being able to adapt this kind of day-to-day lifestyle makes it easy to translate to the trail. And I've never had a problem with blood sugar since I started doing this. So it's been great.
I would agree with that. On my most recent hike, I fasted until noon every day, 4 days in a row, and did 20-mile days, and I felt totally fine. The other benefit is I really like getting out of camp and walking as quickly as possible in the morning. So being able to pop up, get everything packed up, grab a cup of coffee and go, as opposed to waiting on breakfast to cook, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, me too. And I wasn't able to do this even 10 years ago. I really wasn't able to fast intermittently on the trail until I made it a daily habit in my day-to-day life.
Okay, so the next question that a lot of people asked is, what's the best way to eat vegetarian on the trail? And Ryan, you're actually a vegetarian, right?
Yeah, sort of. It's definitely something I've been experimenting with over the last year or so. I am 48 years old and had some blood work come back over the past 3 years, and probably in part as a result of experimenting with ketogenic high meat diets. And my cholesterol and blood pressure and things like this were pretty bad. So, and I've always been very fit and never had issues with physical exertion or anything like that. But I watched my blood markers kind of creep up to the point where they were starting to get a little bit worrisome. And so I started studying diets and experimenting with different things. And right now I've gravitated towards a vegetarian, and even I lean even more towards the vegan side, with an asterisk. I do eat fish, and I'll explain why in a second. But I think that the challenges of eating vegetarian on the trail, they're numerous. It's the same challenges of eating vegetarian in day-to-day life. And the first for me is the biggest challenge when I started this was getting enough protein. And so it motivated me to investigate plant-based protein sources, and finding the ones that I like to eat and worked for me. Because I think if you have food in front of you that you don't like to eat, you're not going to eat it. So it's got to be motivating at some level, even though for me intellectually, I know that food is fuel, but at the same time, I do like to enjoy every moment of my day, and that includes eating. So for protein sources, mostly what I eat during the day is lentils, beans, peas, chickpeas. I'll make smoothies with plant-based protein powders, and all of those things I can eat on the trail as well. They're all available in a dehydrated form or freeze-dried form. And I can make smoothies with some of these plant-based protein powders, just mixing them with water, and they're actually pretty good. So the next thing is, and Brian talked about this, was calcium deficiency, because calcium for vegetarians comes primarily from eating leafy greens and green vegetables. But now there's a plethora of freeze-dried vegetables on the market. You can buy dehydrated spinach and all these kinds of things. So for me, calcium is not a big deal. I from the people I've talked to who are vegan or vegetarian backpackers, their concern with calcium comes because they just don't like eating green food. And that's an issue. So experimenting with recipes to make them tasty is certainly part of the whole equation. And then the other thing is omega-3s, which play a huge role in inflammation and skin health and things like this. And I think they're important for day-to-day living and backpacking. And a lot of vegans will say that they get enough omega-3s out of things like chia or flax seeds. But plant-based omega-3s are comprised of ALA, which is alpha linolenic acid. And it's not a particularly powerful omega-3 fatty acid for the kinds of things we want to benefit from, heart health and inflammation and skin health and things like that. So the other two fatty acids, which are really important, are eicosapentaenoic acid, or EPA, and docosahexaenoic acid, which is DHA. And these are only found in marine animals. So you've got to supplement with either fish oil on the order of 2 to 3 grams of these fatty acids per day, or the equivalent dose that you get from a serving of fish. And I'm kind of partial specifically to sardines and salmon because they do have very high EPA and DHA contents, and they actually dehydrate fairly well for ocean organisms, as long as you wash them in water and get rid of some of the oils beforehand. So those are kind of the summary of the strategies that I'm looking at for eating mostly vegetarian on the trail. So like I said, I'm not a strict vegan. I don't eat dairy or cheese or any other meats, but I do supplement with fish and fish oil.
And what do you put your dehydrated sardines in?
So I always vacuum pack my fish, and I think you have to because the odor is really powerful. And so vacuum packaging in Mylar bags that are odor-proof is kind of critical for fish.
Yeah, I actually meant what other food do you put the sardines in so that they don't taste like sardines?
Oh, you don't like the flavor of sardines?
I've tried. I can't do it.
Yeah, so well, there's a lot of really bad sardines on the market. I buy the cans that come in like 6 packs or 8 packs from Costco, and they're really, really good. But I usually mix them with a pasta dish in some kind of cashew butter sauce or things like that. And I do that with salmon as well.
All right, I'll give that a try. So the next question is, what's the best way to eat gluten-free on the trail?
Anytime someone says gluten-free, we kind of freak out because we're thinking, oh man, don't touch my pasta. And pasta is a big one because it's such an important component of an evening meal when you want to carbo load and replenish your glycogen stores from having hiked for several hours the previous day or that day. So the obvious replacement is rice. White rice, brown rice. It's the cheapest and most available substitute, especially if you buy packaged meals. Instant rice is easily available at most stores. Nutrition aside, it's a bulky, filling dish. But I've since experimented with a variety of gluten-free noodle types because when I was a scout leader, we had scouts who had celiac disease or were otherwise gluten intolerant. So we did a lot of experimentation with gluten-free noodles. So lots of gluten-free pastas are available now. My favorites are the brown rice pastas, and the 2 new ones that I found at Trader Joe's are made of red lentils, and then another one that's made of black beans. And so you also get this pasta that's not only gluten-free, but it's a more complex, slow-burning carb than wheat flour, and it's very high in protein. So these are some of my favorites. And the only drawback to most of this stuff is they're not available in freeze-dried forms for the most part, and they take some cooking time. But the bean pastas are terrific and do not take an exorbitant amount of fuel to cook. So yeah, I'm hoping that companies will kind of respond to this and create some gluten-free options. I never gravitated towards gluten-free pastas for the sake of being gluten-free. So that's one of these ideologies that, I haven't really sorted out yet. But the complex carb pastas, like those that are made from legumes or slow burning grains, for me, it seems like better backpacking food.
I agree. I felt a lot better when I switched over from eating pastas at night towards eating lentils or black beans. So the next question, and we got a lot of this question, is what are some alternatives to Mountain House?
There's a lot of competitors now. I'll preface this by saying that when I started backpacking, it was pretty much just Mountain House, Alpine Air, and Backpacker's Pantry. And they were all really, really terrible. And Mountain House specifically made foods that were were really salty, and I didn't really like that. But now they're all pretty good, and Mountain House are still some of the best tasting packaged meals I've ever had. So I personally really like Mountain House, but what they're limited in for me is, they don't offer a lot of vegan or gluten-free options. So I've been kind of looking for more of those. And three brands I really like are Good to Go, Heather's Choice, and Mary Jane's Farm. And the issue with these is, they tend to contain ingredients that are just a little bit healthier. There's fewer preservatives in there, and they offer many more options for people who are gluten-free or vegetarian. The other thing I really like is building my own freeze-dried meals. Now, I don't have a personal freeze dryer, but building my own freeze-dried meals from freeze-dried ingredients. And, I've been buying ingredients from a company called Harmony House, and we'll link to all these companies in the show notes. And then putting them together into a meal that I create has always been a good option for me.
So what about dehydrating your own meals? Have you ever done any of that?
I have an Excalibur dehydrator. I like it a lot. I've used it mostly to dehydrate soups and fish. And it's pretty good. I'm kind of a busy guy and don't want to spend a lot of time in food prep. So I don't do a lot of it, but I do appreciate the stuff that I've made.
Have you ever done the hack where you sort of put your oven on super low and just leave the door propped open a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think it works. I don't like how the food comes out. And I think the main reason is because you got to have airflow getting rid of the moisture. And so these dehydrators are built-in fans that move the air out, moist air out, and it just creates a chewier food that's more pleasant to eat. And I've had some horrendous failures with oven dehydrating because it seems to me that without airflow in the oven, you get the middle of the food, the center, still wet and hydrated, and the outside gets totally dry and crispy. So I don't do that anymore.
So what about freeze drying your own meals?
So here's an area that is really appealing to me. I don't have a freeze dryer. I really, really want one. There's a company called Harvest Right that makes home freeze drying machines, kind of tabletop. They're big, so you kind of got to have a spot for them. And they're expensive. They cost about $2,000, but this is way cheaper than the portable freeze dry technology that was available 20 years ago, which cost $20,000 or more dollars. So I'm really hoping that some competitors will jump in and drive the price down, because I think this would be a terrific addition. I know that freeze drying your own meals preserves more nutritional content in the foods than exposing them to heat during dehydration.
And the last option would be to cobble together just sort of your own stuff from stores.
Yeah, this is the thru-hiker mentality for sure. And I'm not very good at it, but I do really like living in an area that has access to Trader Joe's now. I have a Trader Joe's store about an hour south of where I live. And that is one of my all-time favorite places to buy backpacking food, because they have so many different packaged options of good, nutritious foods. Everything from, the spiced nut selection is terrific, and they've got freeze-dried fruits and freeze-dried vegetables and bean pastas and all these crazy things. It's really great.
Well, that kind of leads us into our next question. We had a lot of people ask this also. How do you find food in your standard chain grocery store that is lightweight, long-lasting, and nutritionally complete, i.e. not Pop-Tarts and ramen? In conjunction with this, how do you get the vitamins and minerals normally found in fresh produce? And I guess I would just speak to it by saying, I guess I'm going to read your standard chain grocery store as meaning your Kroger, your Food Lion, your kind of not Trader Joe's that you're going to find in a standard trail town. So I've had a lot of success visiting the Asian and Mexican food aisle of those types of grocery stores, and they usually have them. And you can usually find some pretty delicious lentil dishes in the Indian section that will get you a lot of protein, a lot of good carbs, and they're normally spiced very well, especially if you like spicy food. In terms of getting the vitamins and minerals normally found in fresh produce, I would agree with Brian that the best way to do that is while you're in town, eat some fresh produce. And, I know a lot of hikers that are willing to pack a couple of cans of beer, up into the next few days after they leave town and then just hike out the empty aluminum can. If you're willing to do that, you ought to be willing to take the weight of a couple of oranges, or a banana or an avocado and just extend that dosage of good nutrients, on a few days after you leave town.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when I guide for backpacking light. A lot of times I'll take an orange for that first day, and when I pull it out on the trail, you get these looks of illegitimacy. Why are you packing this water filled orange? One time I brought watermelon, which is even worse. I think it's okay to do that, especially early in your trip when you're going to eat the food quick or you're not quite doing high mileages yet. It's the added weight is not a big deal. And this food goes a long way at preserving nutrition in your overall diet. So I don't get too anxious about planning meticulously lightweight meals when I know that I can shed some of this weight in the first couple of days if I am taking fresh fruits or fresh vegetables. So in terms of shopping at chain grocery stores, weight is certainly an issue because they don't have the freeze dried options that you'll find at outdoor specialty shops. But, in terms of nutritionally complete, wing it a little bit and expand what you might think is backpacking food and include foods that are part of your daily diet. Okay, our next question is from Steve LeBrun. And he asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of going stoveless, specifically in terms of weight, but also in terms of available foods and nutrition? I don't have much experience going stoveless, Andrew, so you'll have to speak to this one.
I don't have a ton of experience either. The experience I have is that I hiked a couple of 100 miles with a guy who was going stoveless, and he swore by it. And what he would do is he would buy the mountain house, the backpacker's pantry meals. And in the morning when he woke up, he would fill them with the amount of water that the package necessitated. He'd seal it back up. They seal back up really well. Toss it in his pack, hike with it all day long. And then by the time he got done with his mileage, he'd pop it open and it would be rehydrated. Now, to me, that just means you're hiking with a lot of extra water. And I'm not sure that once you factor that in, that you've actually saved anything by not carrying a stove. So to me, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you may not save anything. I can think of one benefit of this, and the benefit comes by taking care of the rest of your gear. So if you're already carrying a really light pack, maybe a half pound or a pound of water weight is not going to be a huge deal. So I would say that it's probably a bigger deal if your pack's already super heavy, then why would you do this? But for most people, if they're carrying a super heavy pack, they're probably carrying a pretty heavy stove as well. But yeah, I mean, there's some simplicity to not having to fool around with the stove, but it probably requires some forethought and planning and intentionality on the trail to deal with rehydrating meals as you go as well without hot water. For me, it's a morale issue. Most of the places I hike and during the seasons when I hike, and I spend most of my time up in the mountains where it's cold at night. And man, a hot meal goes a long way at improving my morale when the sun goes down.
Yeah, and just getting started in the morning too. A cup of tea, a cup of coffee, can go a long way.
Yeah, you bet.
Well, that actually leads us into our next question, which is about coffee tips. John Foraker asks, what's the best way to get good coffee in the backcountry, and what is the best tasting powdered creamer or creamer alternative? So, John, I can say that I am not a coffee snob. So what I've tended to do is just let a couple of Folgers coffee tea bags steep way longer than the package says, and that usually gets me good to go. But Ryan, do you have any ideas here?
Yeah, I've never been real good friends with people who've drank Folgers, so this is a first for me. So this is testing my resolve. I'm a coffee snob, so I really appreciate good coffee. And John, I want to encourage you to ditch the creamer because you're ruining the taste of what could be a beautiful cup of coffee. So no, don't take powdered creamer alternative. Enjoy that coffee flavor. But seriously, some people will take dried fatty milk, and there's a brand that's made by Nestle in Nestle's Mexico division called Nido, Nido. And it is a high milk fat milk, and they have various options from 3 to 7% milk fat. And I know a number of people who've taken Nido as their creamer, and it looks awfully good. It's very rich and very thick, and that might be an option for you. And speaking of a beautiful cup of coffee, we'll put a link to an article in the show notes written by Mike Clellan. It's a classic Backpacking Light article, and he writes all about various coffee alternatives there to help you kind of narrow in different coffee brewing methods and their advantages and disadvantages. So for me, I do take instant coffee on occasion when I know that I just want a quick cup and don't want to fool around with coffee grounds and whatnot. And Starbucks Via is hard to beat. It's a very high quality coffee. It tastes good. I found another organic version from Mount Hagen. It's not as strong as Via, but it's a little bit easier on your stomach. I know a lot of people like pour overs and French press coffee. And if that's your style, there's a variety of lightweight devices available, and we'll link to some of those in the show notes as well. In addition, if you're really, really passionate about espresso, there's a new product on the market. It's called a NanoPresso. It's a hand pump espresso machine that weighs 12 ounces, which is a ridiculous amount of weight for an ultralight backpacker. But it is literally the lightest device available that will give you a true shot of espresso. So the big thing with espresso is that it's drawn at a high pressure. Most espresso machines are calibrated to 9 bars of pressure, which is about 130 pounds per square inch. The NanoPresso can deliver double that, 18 bars or 260 psi. It creates this incredible crema, and the coffee is really, really good. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well. A little bit heavy, but if coffee's your passion, you might want to take a look at that one.
And I feel like I should just mention before we get a lot of hate mail here that I do not drink Folgers in my day-to-day life.
See, now Brian said your diet needs to reflect what you drink day to day.
Okay, what kinds of challenges and solutions could someone with diabetes expect to face on a multi-day trip? And this question is from Adam Markinikowicz. And Adam, I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly.
So yeah, diabetes, the biggest thing is blood sugar management, right? So I'm not diabetic, but I've hiked with a lot of diabetics, and I'm fascinated by what they do to manage their diabetes, especially on an intense long trip. And the two things that I've learned is that they consume carbs frequently to prevent the highs and lows of blood sugar. The second thing they do is they up the high fiber and complex carbs in their diet. So I see diabetics eating a lot of freeze-dried vegetables and legumes and things like that. So those are the two observations I'd made during my times of hiking with diabetics. And again, I'll have to qualify this. We're not medical professionals. So if you're diabetic and need to dial in a backpacking diet, absolutely consult a nutritionist or whoever's mentoring you and get some advice from them.
Absolutely. So the next question is from Ronnie Spitzer, and he asks, what's the best way to get enough fiber and stay regular on multi-day trips?
Yeah, for me, it's the addition of legumes and freeze-dried vegetables. And I've mentioned both of these before, and they're absolutely the two core foods that I'm consuming on a backpacking trip.
It's interesting how those two things seem to solve multiple problems.
Yeah, I mean, you've got slow burning carbs, which is great for an aerobic activity like backpacking. And both of them can be freeze-dried very easily, and they're readily available and provide lots of bulk to fill you up.
All right, this one's an anonymous question. And the question is, what are some ideas for lunchtime food, no cook, other than protein bars and snacks?
I have no tolerance for protein bars. I can't stand eating them. I do snack a lot. I told you earlier about my early diet of backpacking, which was chips, cookies, candy, and that you can't sustain yourself on that. So I have explored lunchtime meals more recently, and I think my favorite recipe is a tortilla with some freeze-dried hummus or guacamole in there, dry roasted red tomatoes, maybe a serving of smoked salmon, and a packet of mustard. And it feels like a sandwich and tastes like a sandwich. And it's just nice to be able to sit down on the trail in the middle of the day and not have to rip the corner off a snack bag and feel like you're eating like a rabbit.
So what's a good protein source other than jerky that does not require refrigeration? This question is from Sean Amelie.
Yeah, for me, it's, again, legumes is my core protein source for backpacking food. And then when I'm eating fish, it'll be, salmon usually. But I've also experimented with plant protein based shake powders. And, I bought this one at Costco. I don't recall the brand, but what I discovered, I've always eaten whey protein, but the plant protein ones are much easier on your stomach. I got like stomach aches from whey, and there's a taste and smell the whey that I just didn't like. And so I'd find that I'd have to mask the flavor with a variety of additives. And this plant protein shake powder, it comes in chocolate and vanilla, and the chocolate is really good. And so you just mix that with water and go, and it gives you a shot at 20 grams of protein. It's great.
Do you find the plant protein powders clump up a lot easier, like make it harder to mix up?
No, I think that it's about equal to whey, at least from what I found. So I don't know that there's a difference there.
So you spoke to the fish. I like packages of chicken. I like the chicken because I think it sticks to the ribs a little more. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a huge fan of that super fishy fish. So I think the chicken, you can stir that up into a lot of different foods. And then instead of making it taste like chicken, what you have in your bowl will make the chicken taste like what you have in your bowl, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I used to eat chicken quite a bit on the trail.
So Emmy Loxo has the next question. And she asks, what are some foods that will last longer in your pack than the label says they will? I've discovered that cream cheese will keep for 3 to 4 days in shoulder season temps.
In cold temperatures, just about anything will last. Once you start getting up into temperatures that range from about the high 50s on up, and it starts getting really dramatic once you get into the 70s, then it's definitely something you have to pay attention to. And I can't recommend this from a health standpoint, but the more preservatives in your food, the better. And, that's kind of the antithesis to the trend towards more nutritious and organic foods and things like that. But my experience on the trail is that organic fresh foods or organic hydrated foods like cheeses and things like that, they just don't last as long. I did some experiments with tortillas specifically and found that organic tortillas molded within a day or two, and a good old fashioned Mission flour tortilla would last for a 10-day trek. So yeah, look at the preservatives, what's in there. And for cheese specifically, look at hard versus soft cheeses. So soft cheeses like mozzarella, they tend to mold faster than hard cheeses like sharp cheddar.
Have you ever played around with blocks of Parmesan?
Yeah, Parmesan's a very hard cheese and it lasts a long time. It's a great option. And the nice thing about Parmesan is that when it does start to mold, the mold grows really, really slow. So it doesn't get too deep in the cheese, and you can just scrape it off and keep going.
Well, my favorite food that lasts longer than the label says it will is a nice classic package of summer sausage. I've yet to push a package of summer sausage past its edibility. But I think that the problem with that is that unlike cheese, if it goes off, it's not maybe not as immediately obvious. So there you may be risking a little bit there. So this next question is related, and it's from Max, just one name. What are some foods that will keep well when it's warm outside?
Yeah, so this is related to the last one. And so my recommendations, I have 3 of them. The first is that the less water content the food has, the better. So drier foods will stay edible longer. The more preservatives, the better. And I mean better by longevity in warm conditions. And then stay away from stuff that melts. Chocolate is going to be risky once the temperature starts to climb.
All right, so now I thought we would do a speed round. I'm going to hit you with 4 questions. Just give me your best answer as fast as you can.
You got it.
All right, best way to improve the taste of any dish.
Crushed red pepper flakes.
Favorite backcountry recipe.
Good to go mushroom risotto. It's a packaged meal with a foil packet of Sea Bear smoked salmon.
Favorite on-the-go snack.
Almond butter.
Favorite trail mix recipe.
M&Ms.
Simplicity, hard to beat.
Okay, so let's throw these right back at you, Andrew. So what's your best way to improve the taste of any dish?
Sriracha.
Ooh, good one. How about your favorite backcountry recipe?
Well, this is going to fly in the face of my experiments with keto and basically everything that Brian said. But my favorite is backcountry pad thai, which is oriental flavor ramen, a scoop of crunchy peanut butter, and sriracha.
That sounds amazing. Favorite on-the-go snack?
I got to go with beef jerky.
Favorite trail mix recipe?
M&Ms, raisins, and peanuts. If it was good enough for my grandfather, it is good enough for me.
Okay, let's move on to the gear segment of the show. Andrew, you recently tested MSR's trail-based water filter for an upcoming Spotlight review. What are your initial thoughts?
You know, I really liked this little filter. Well, and I guess I should say it's a filter system. It has a component that weighs about 6 ounces that you can filter water while you're on the trail. And then when you get to camp, you can open up the reservoirs, connect the 6-ounce filter to the reservoirs, and you can filter water using gravity. So what I thought was interesting about this is I got about 1 liter of water per 60 seconds from the trail filter itself. And with the gravity filter component, I filtered 2 liters of water in about 3 minutes.
That beats pumping.
It does beat pumping. But I was actually surprised that the trail filter component was so efficient. And I think that for some purists, they might just say, you know what, leave the gravity system behind, you know, the extra, I believe is extra 7 or 8 ounces. Just take the filter, which is available by itself as the trail shot, and don't worry about the gravity component. So what I'd be interested in seeing is over the long term, how that filter cartridge holds up, especially under less than ideal circumstances. I was testing in mostly clear, fast-moving streams, because my suspicion is that as the filter gradually clogs, the gravity filtration component is going to become more and more efficient as opposed to filtering by hand.
Yeah, that makes sense. You can take advantage of hydrostatic head by putting the gravity filter over the filter and take advantage of that. So yeah, that makes sense. So can you back flush the filter?
Yes, you can. It's pretty easy. You basically just remove one of the tubes and shake the filter 20 times or so and let the water drain out.
So what's the weight of it?
Total weight is 1 pound, 6 ounces. That's the MSR provided specs.
And that includes that's the one that includes the gravity filter, right?
Right. It includes a clean water reservoir, a dirty water reservoir, and all of the tubing associated with those 2 things, and then the filter, which can be used separately.
Okay, so that's a little bit lighter than the old platypus system, even by a few ounces. So that's great.
Yeah, I found it to be really intuitive. I found all the pieces to snap together really easily. Overall, I really enjoyed using it. So I hear you've been looking at alcohol stoves again.
Yeah, you know, I'm not a huge fan of alcohol stoves and never have been. I've always wanted a stove that was really easy to use and had plenty of power for cold, inclement weather. So, you know, my stove of choice is usually an MSR wind burner, but I would like a hot cup of coffee on a day hike, or I would like something simple that I can pack when I'm on a quick overnight. And so I have taken another look at alcohol stoves, and Backpacking Light recently published an article where we reviewed the Zelf Starlight and the Trail Designs Kojin. And I've been looking at both of those and practicing with those. They remind me of the old Scandinavian alcohol stoves that had a screw-on cap so that you could just put the fuel in the stove and use it on the fly. And these stoves offer that as well, but at much less weight. So I'm liking it for short trips.
Well, now it's time for our Here and Now segment, where we share a little bit about what we're currently studying, learning about, testing, or planning when it comes to our backpacking gear, skills, and activities. So Ryan, what are you up to this month?
Yeah, so I just returned from Campbell, California, where I was invited to speak at the Switchback Showcase, which was a film premiere event hosted by Chris Smead, who's been a Backpacking Light affiliated author and filmmaker for the past couple of years. And Chris premiered his documentary about the High Sierra Trail, which was an absolutely spectacular film, and I can't wait for it to be released. It's kind of on a film festival circuit right now, so it's not available for public viewing, but a really great movie. And Jason Fitzpatrick, who created the film Mile and a Half, also premiered a couple of films there, and both of them were terrific. So it was a really cool event, and I got to talk to a packed house about the changes we've seen in our society and how it's impacting wilderness participation. So it was a great time.
I love Mile and a Half. That's a great film.
Yeah, I loved Mile and a Half too. And his new movie that he premiered looked at 4 people who were attempting FKTs, or fastest known times on the JMT, and it was a great story. Okay, Andrew, so what's going on with you right now? What are you up to?
Well, I tested that water filter in the Gilas, which I'd never been to before, and they are absolutely amazing. Very wild, very beautiful. I was plagued by blisters, despite having good socks, minimalist trail runners, a light pack. But see, this is always my problem. I always get blisters no matter what I do, and I have tried everything, every type of shoe, every type of sock, you name it, I've tried it. So I'm tired of it. I'm about to embark on some serious outside-the-box thinking on blister prevention. So if anyone has any ideas, feel free to hit me up at the podcast email.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. That's brutal. And I know, on our podcast editorial calendar, at some point soon, I hope that we can put out an episode on foot care and podiatry and things like this. So you can't wait that long, obviously, but good luck. I feel your pain. Blisters are brutal. Okay, so with that, we're in the process of planning the summer podcast series, and the format's going to change a little bit for the summer months. We'll likely shorten the podcast a little bit just to make it a little easier to produce on our end. Andrew and I will be in the field quite a bit during the months of June, July, and August. And in June, we're going to do a field podcast. I'll be leading with Kevin Fletcher, our Wilderness Adventures Guides training seminar in the Beartooth Wilderness up in Montana. And so we're going to record a roundtable discussion about ultralight backpacking with our guides in training up there. So that will become the bulk of that podcast. So I'm kind of excited for that one.
And with that, we have reached the end of our podcast. This podcast is brought to you by backpackinglight.com, which has been providing information and education about lightweight wilderness travel since the year 2000. The Backpacking Light podcast is supported by subscription fees paid by our loyal website subscribers, and we're extremely grateful for your support. A backpackinglight.com subscription can save you time and money on your quest to lighten your pack weight, spend more time in the outdoors, and connect with a community of like-minded hikers. So if you aren't yet a backpackinglight.com subscriber, please consider subscribing and gain access to nearly 1 million forum posts, 4 million words of original content, more than 2,000 articles, and access to our Wilderness Adventures trekking programs. You can subscribe online right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe.
If you have feedback, questions, or tips for our listeners, please share them via email at podcast@backpackinglight.com. You can download the show notes for this episode by visiting backpackinglight.com/podcast. And you can find this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Leave us a review, especially on iTunes, because it helps other people find the show.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one party message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the car.